Good morning, everyone, and welcome back on this quite chilly Sunday morning that we had. I know as I was driving there was quite a bit of a breeze going on, so glad you all could make it. We're going to go ahead and look at Genesis chapter 14 this morning, so you can go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 14. We've started looking at the life of this man Abraham, for whom God has given a great promise, and that's kind of what we spent most of our time looking at last time, was this promise that God gave Abraham that he would make him a great nation if he would but leave his father's family, if he would leave the land that his father had been in and come into a land that God would show him. God would make him and his descendants a great nation. And not only would he make Abraham a great nation, or at this point he's known as Abram, he would also bless those who blessed Abram and his family, and he would curse those who cursed Abram and his family. And he also made a promise to the whole world that a blessing would come through Abram's family. And we believe this is another giving of the gospel, because we know that Jesus Christ would be born as a descendant of Abram. And so Abram is given this promise. He leaves his father as commanded, and travels south towards what we would call now the Promised Land. But there's a famine that occurs there. And so Abram is forced to leave this land that God had showed him and go into Egypt. And there he's afraid for his life because of his wife's great beauty. He is apparently of the conviction that the Egyptians are going to kill him just to take his wife. So he has her tell only a half-truth. We know from a later passage in Genesis chapter 20, I believe it is, that Sarah was Abram's half-sister, but he has Sarah only tell that part of the truth, not the part of the truth that she was also his wife. And so God begins to plague Pharaoh for that, and so it ends up actually ruining Abram's testimony with these unbelieving Egyptians because of this lie that he told. So he's told by Pharaoh to leave, so he ends up leaving and coming back to the Promised Land, where we saw last time that his flocks and his herds were too much to be in the same land as Lot's herds and flocks, and so the two of them end up having to split up. And Abram leaves Lot with the choice, pick which side you're going to go, and Abram sees the plain of Jordan as being a nicer land, as being a more plenteous land, and so he chooses to go there, but in so doing it brings him closer to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which at the kind of at the end of that section in verse 13 it says, the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So the men of Sodom have this reputation, and yet we see Lot pitching his tent in that direction, where he's clearly headed towards a city that has already a reputation of sin, and we're going to see that has consequences later on. But after Lot leaves, God makes God makes a promise to Abram again, that he would give all the land that he walks on as a promised land for him and his descendants. So today we're going to look at, in verse 14, kind of some of the early consequences of Lot's choice to go towards the plain of Jordan, to go towards the city of Sodom. So Genesis 14 verse 1 says, and it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea, which we believe to be the Dead Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. So we have this coalition of kings led by apparently a stronger king called Chedorlaomer, ruling over some of these other kingdoms. So we have kind of this, I guess you might say, an empire. The difference between a kingdom and an empire is a kingdom is just one nation ruled by one king. An empire would be multiple kingdoms ruled by one kingdom. So you kind of have here a little empire led by a man called Chedorlaomer. Well, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and some of these other places are displeased with being a part of this empire. And so they rebel against this man, Chedorlaomer. It says, in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims, and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims and Ham, and the Emims and Kirithium, and the Horites in their Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwell in Hazazon Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer the king of Elam, and with Tidal king of nations, and Amraphel king of Shinar, and Arioch king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. So these 5 kings rebel against Chedorlaomer's forces, and they end up losing in this area full of tar pits. And so at this point, those under the victorious kings end up going, and they end up taking everything from Sodom and Gomorrah. So we have here Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 cities ruled by these 2 kings, are part of this rebellion, and they end up losing. And so as part of their loss, okay, they end up fleeing into the mountains, and those left behind, those suddenly no longer being guarded by a military, they are kidnapped. And so then Abram hears about this. There came one that had escaped, verse 13, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. So Abram here is already making friends with some of the people around him, and one of the people escapes from this battle, and they come and they tell Abram. So when Abram heard that his brother, understanding that this is not a contradiction. Okay, previously Lot is referred to as Abram's nephew. Okay, but understanding that in these types of cultures, oftentimes when the father would die, the eldest son would kind of take up that mantle. And so this is not necessarily a contradiction of Scripture where it's saying, oh, Lot was his direct brother. But he was of his brother's family. And so we understand that from reading Scripture in all of its context. So when Abram heard that his brother, that is by understanding Lot, his nephew, was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. So remember how in the previous lesson we talked about how extensive Abram's possessions are. He here has 318 servants that he can arm. He has his own almost miniature kind of army. We look at 318 and we think, well, that's not a super large amount of people. But understand that we're talking about kingdoms that are also quite small, where you have a kingdom that's just really encompassing just one city. And so 318 to our mind and to our estimates with the grand armies of nations that we have today, we look at 318, we might think, well, that's not very much. Well, back then, for one man to have 318 servants that he could turn into a military, that's a big deal. So he arms them, he divides the servant himself against these kings that had taken his nephew. Verse 15, he divided himself against them and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. So Abram here is blessed enough by God that he is able to arm his servants, go and beat up on a bunch of kings who previously could not have been beaten by a confederation of 4 other kings. And so God here is again blessing Abram in his endeavor. And so with that, Abram arms his servants, retrieves his nephew, and then the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him in the valley of Sheva, which is the king's dale. So the king suddenly comes out from the mountain where he had been hiding. He realizes, hey, the guy who just beat me has been beaten, so I think I can come out of hiding. And he shows up on Abram's doorstep. and that's where we are introduced to this man named Melchizedek, verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hands. And he, that is Abram, gave him tithes of all. Amen. So we're introduced to this man named Melchizedek, who is a somewhat controversial figure in the halls of seminary. I remember when I was in college, there was this great divide amongst the seminary teachers. You either believed that Melchizedek was Christ, a pre-incarnate Christ, or you believed that he was a type of Christ. And the two sides would often have lively debates within the seminary about whether or not Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate Christ or just a type of Christ. I happen to fall on the side that he is a type of Christ, not that he is a priest, not that he actually was a pre-incarnate Christ. And I don't think that it's one of those things that I necessarily need to split and divide and shun my other brethren for. But we're just going to take a look at this figure because he does show up in the New Testament as well. So we're going to look at him from Genesis chapter 14. We're going to look at who he is and some of his identifying characteristics. And then we're going to look in Hebrews chapter 7. So if you kind of want to stick your finger here and go to Hebrews 7, so when we flip there, it'll probably be a little bit easier. So, according to Genesis 14, who was Melchizedek? Well, first of all, it said he was a priest of the Most High God. I think I got this backward on your sheet. On your sheet, I think I have King of Salem first and the High Priest second. But either way, we have here someone who is not of the descendants of Abram. Okay, he's not a part of that family tree. But here we have someone who rules his own kingdom. We understand that Salem is most likely here referring to what would eventually be known as Jerusalem. And he is a priest of the Most High God, but he's also a king. So he is a priest and a king, which normally in cultures of this time were fulfilled by two different people. You didn't typically have the king serving also as a priest. Usually you would have, the king would govern the affairs of the nation, and you would have a separate priest, a high priest, who would govern the affairs of whatever religious faith that particular people group followed. Well, here you have a person who is fulfilling the role of both. And we see a little bit more of this man in Hebrews chapter 7. The author of Hebrews, which it's kind of funny, I talked about Melchizedek being a great divide. The author of Hebrews is apparently also another great divide. So we're talking about divide within a divide. Hebrews chapter 7, we're going to be looking at, let's see here, verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abram returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. That's what we saw earlier with the tithes. Being by interpretation, king of righteousness. That is literally what Melchizedek means in Hebrew, is king of righteousness. And after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now this is where that divide comes into play, because you have someone here who is mentioned as not having beginning or end. And so some look at that passage and say, oh, well, this must mean that he is God here. And certainly king of righteousness and king of peace would be names that would fit who God is, and names that would fit who Jesus himself is, given that Jesus is king of all the earth, and he is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And so some look at this verse and say, these verses and say, well, he's without father, mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. These are things that describe who God is. And then there are others who say, well, this could also just simply refer to the fact that it's not recorded who his family was. He is, as far as historical records go, completely obscure. There are no records of Melchizedek outside of the Bible. The Bible does not record his family tree. We do not see anywhere within the genealogies of Genesis where this man Melchizedek comes from. We have no records of his birth. We have no records of his death. We have no records of who his parents are. But he is a type, it says, made like unto the Son of God. And from his family, we have a line of priests who would not be priests by inheritance in the same way that the Aaronic priesthood would be. Those priests who were descended from Aaron. Okay, in order to be a priest within the Hebrew faith, you had to either descend directly from Aaron, okay, and he was somewhere in your ancestral tree, or you had to be of the family of Levi and be a Levite. Well, we have here yet another line of priests that this one did not necessarily come from an inheritance. You didn't have to be necessarily descended from Melchizedek in order to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now consider how great this man was. Verse 4, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises, and without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And so here the author of Hebrews is again saying, yeah, the Levites, they were commanded by law to take of the tithe, but Abraham was not commanded by law to give a tithe, to give a tenth to this priest Melchizedek. And so Abram is blessed by this. And it goes on further. You can read through verses 15 onward, where it talks about how Jesus is a priest forever after from the order of Melchizedek, and how that helps Jesus fulfill the parts of the priest and being of the line of David, the king. And he was also a prophet. And we understand that Jesus had to be prophet, priest, and king to be the Messiah. So he is a priest after the order of this man, Melchizedek. So I have here, Melchizedek is a type of Christ. You may read the passage and you may disagree with me, and that's fine. I will not shun your fellowship for it. And I'm sure one day when we get to heaven, we'll either find out that I was wrong or that I was right. We'll see. I am no great Bible scholar, and I'm sure there are people who are better than me who would have a difference of opinion, and that is fine. But as I read through the scriptures, this is what I came to as a conclusion. So we have this man, this king, this priest, Melchizedek, who greets Abram, and so then Abram gives him a tenth of his riches. Okay, note that it says back in Genesis chapter 14, it says, and he gave him, Abram gave Melchizedek tithes of all. So Abram has just gotten this rich spoil from beating these kings, from beating essentially this empire led by Chedorlaomer. And so when he comes across this priest, he ends up giving him a tithe, even though at this point there has been no command to do so. And this is one of the verses that we look to when we talk about a Christian's responsibility to give. A lot of people will say, well, the tithe was an Old Testament Levitical law thing. And as Christians, we don't have to give a tithe anymore, because that was part of that Levitical law. We don't need to worry about it anymore. Well, here we have Abram, who is giving a tithe, and the Levitical law hasn't even been written yet. But here he is doing his duty, and he is giving of the tenth to this priest. And so as Christians, we also ought to be giving. There are several passages in the New Testament that talk about how we ought to be generous and we ought to give. Not just to our neighbors, not just to the people who we're friendly with, but we ought to give to the church. If we receive the benefits of pastoral care, and we sit under the preaching of a pastor and under his care, we ought to be giving. And we have that here even all the way back in Genesis. Remember, I said Genesis is a book of beginnings of a lot of different things. It's a book of origins. And here we even have the origin of the tithe. Now, moving on, after he gives Melchizedek tithes, the king of Sodom said unto Abram, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. So the king of Sodom, remember again that we saw in chapter, I believe, 13. Yes, chapter 13, that Sodom is considered an evil city. It has a wicked reputation. But here, I don't know whether it was out of a thankful heart or maybe perhaps out of a heart of fear. The king of Sodom comes to Abram and says, look, just give me the people of my city back. You can keep all of the stuff. Whether he was being kind to Abram out of thankfulness or because maybe he thought Abram would try to fight him if he tried to take his stuff back, I do not know. But he gives this offer to Abram. He basically is allowing Abram to keep everything. This is a huge offer, like all the spoils that were taken from these other kings. This would have enriched Abraham greatly. But Abram said to Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So here we have Abram basically saying, I don't want you to be able to have any credit in this whatsoever. Okay, Abram, I do not think, was ignorant of the reputation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Later on, he's definitely going to plead on behalf of the city for the sake of Lot, but I don't think he was ignorant of their evil. And he said, look, I don't want anything that belongs to you. I don't want you to have the ability to tell me or to tell anyone that I'm rich because of you. So you can have everything back. But he does understand that, the people needed to eat, his soldiers needed to be paid, his servants needed to be paid, and that the kings who went with him, his allies, would also need to be paid for their work. But he himself keeps nothing from this wicked city. And I can't help but think of all of the times where perhaps it's been an offer has been made to achieve wealth in kind of a shady manner. Whether it's a promotion for committing some kind of act of fraud, maybe it's cheating on the taxes, maybe it's it's a lot of maybe it's through gambling and through benefiting off of the misfortunes of others. We as Christians ought not to take advantage of such things. We ought not to have wealth gained from shady places, I guess you might say. Abram here wanted nothing to do with the wealth of Sodom. He did not want wickedness to be able to say, oh yeah, Abram is as great as he is, not because of his God, but because of this stuff that I gave him. That would hurt his testimony, for sure. And as Christians, we ought to think through the same way. It's something that we as Christians need to be aware of, that we ought to be trusting God for our rewards. We ought to be trusting God for our wealth and for our riches, rather than taking things into our own hands and attempting to gain our wealth in the manner that so many of the wicked around us attempt to gain their wealth. And so, but we also see here that we ought to reward those who serve us well. Abram didn't, he did not defraud those others that came with him, his allies that came with him. He made sure that they were paid, but he himself wanted to make sure that nothing of what he took could be used against him later on. So now we come to Genesis chapter 15, and we have here a renewal of the promise that God has made. So as we look at verses 1 through 5, and after these things, so after all that happened with the rescuing of Lot, and let me pause here for a moment. Lot had a chance here to get out of Sodom. He had a chance. He had been taken away from his home. He had been rescued by Abram. He could have repented. He could have turned around. and moved away from Sodom. But we understand, as we'll see later, he just goes straight back. I mean, not only does he go straight back, he goes even further than where he had been before. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But I find that curious that Lot here is given a chance to backtrack, but instead he chooses to go straight back to where he was. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. Behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now to the heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And God said unto him, So shall thy seed be. So God renews his promise to Abram that he would make of him a great nation. And Abram here is starting to have his doubts. I mean, as we looked at before, he's an old man. He is well into his 90s. His wife is also very up in years. And Abram is thinking, well, is this, is your promise going to pass through Eliezer, through my steward? In these traditions, in these times, possessions would need to be passed on. And if one did not have their own child to pass their possessions on to, often they would the inheritance would pass to the most trusted servant. And so Abram tells God, look, are these promises meant for Eliezer? He's the one who is my heir right now. And God says, no, you are going to have your own son. He calls on Abram to have faith again. He takes him out and says, look at all the stars. Your descendants are going to be as the stars. They are going to be innumerable. And in verse 6 says, And Abram believed in the Lord, and he, the Lord, counted it to him, Abram, for righteousness. Now, yes, Abram had believed. We see that through Abram's actions that there was clearly belief. God told him to leave, he left. Abram took his servants and went and liberated Lot. He gave tithes to the priest of God. And so we have all these actions, but note that those actions were not counted to Abram for righteousness. It was a belief. Abram believed in the Lord, and this is what was counted to him for righteousness. We understand that salvation comes through faith. It's not, I cannot do anything to please God. I cannot commit some kind of action or a series of actions that will somehow, when I get to heaven, cause God to have to admit me into heaven.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
I don't, it's not like there's, as the Egyptians taught, there's not a scale that's balancing my heart versus my good and bad works. It's not as some of these other faiths where you have to commit a certain number of actions or follow a certain path in order to be able to achieve heaven. It's only through belief. Abram had done all of these things, but up until this point, they were actions, but this belief, this is what God says, was counted to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. And Abram said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? The Lord said unto Abram, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds he divided not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcass, Abram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come thither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. And the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. So here God makes a covenant with himself for Abram's sake. This is a blood covenant. Blood, again, as we saw in Genesis chapter 9, blood is where the life is. Blood is sacred in God's sight. And so this covenant, being a blood covenant, being upon the lives of these animals that have been slain, was a very serious thing. And we see blood covenants throughout different cultures and throughout different nations. Again, signifying that we all understand, and we all come from the same place. We all have the same heritage through Noah, and we all understand, even these cultures that are so far removed from God, that blood is a very, very important thing. And so this covenant was meant to seal a pact. The idea was that both parties were to walk between the split parts of these animals. And as they looked upon the blood that had been spilt to make this covenant, it was supposed to reinforce just how serious this covenant being made was. But God does not allow Abram to walk through the pieces of the animals. He instead forces Abram to fall asleep. And there God makes a covenant essentially with himself. Because there was no way that Abram was going to be able to do anything to keep this covenant. This was completely all on God's side. And that God was making this promise to Abram to reinforce that, it's hard for me to fault Abram for his doubts. Again, he's an old man, and God here is making promises that he's going to be a great nation, that he's going to have all this land, and this land is being owned by all these tribes that are mentioned later. There's already people who have settled here. But God reinforces this promise with a blood covenant to put any doubts that Abram may have had to rest once and for all. Abram had no part in keeping this covenant. There was nothing that Abram had to do in order for this land to be given to his descendants. Nowhere in these instructions that God gives does God tell Abram, you need to keep these certain laws, or you need to make sure you do this, that, or the other thing. He says, no, this is the promise that I've given you. This is going to happen. The only person who has a part in this covenant is God. And I find it interesting that God also here gives a prophecy of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
He talks about how the Israelites would be held in bondage for 400 years in a land that was not their own. And that when they left, that the nation that held them captive would be judged through the 10 plagues that we see in Exodus. And that when the Israelites would leave, they would leave with great substance. God told them when they left Egypt to take of any jewelry that their Egyptian masters had with them, rings and necklaces and things like that. The Israelites did not leave the nation of Israel poor, even though they were slaves. And he also tells Abram the condition in which the Israelites would come back to the promised land. Notice in verse 16, but in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God had every intention on punishing these people, the Amorites, for their iniquities, for their sins. But notice it's not yet full. They had a chance still. They have some time given to them, 400 years. And in those 400 years, in spite of the testimonies of people like Melchizedek, in spite of testimonies of Abram and eventually Isaac and Jacob and their children, in spite of that, the Amorites are still going to continue in their sin. And later on in the book of Exodus, and even further on, God is going to command their punishment for their iniquities. This covenant was God's promise to give Abram's descendants land. And this takes a lot of faith on Abram's part, because this is not God saying, I'm going to give this to you. Abram would not receive any of the benefits of this promise. he would be forever a nomad for the rest of his life. He would live to a good old age. He would be buried in peace. But none of the land that he walked would be possessed or owned by him, save the plot of ground where he buried Sarah and where he himself would eventually be buried. That's all the land that he would own in the promised land. But God makes his covenant with him and says, your descendants, they will own this. And he again makes that covenant through a very serious blood covenant that he has. I find it interesting again, in Genesis 12, God makes a promise to Abram. Later on in Genesis 12, Abram is going to lack some faith in that promise. Well, God has just made a very serious oath to Abram in chapter 15. And next time we're going to see in Genesis 16, Abram lacks faith again. And we'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but at the same time, as I see this happening, as I see God making these promises and Abram lacking faith, I can't help but look at my own life and see myself. I have this great and precious book that is full of God's promises to me, and yet how many times do I find myself, I'll read my Bible about something, or I'll hear a message preached about a certain promise, and it will reassure me and it will comfort me, but then I wake up the next morning and it's like I never even heard it in the first place. And I completely forget, and I act as if I had never heard that promise before. And Abram is going to do that, but again, the covenant that was made, nothing hinged on Abram. And the same is true of our salvation. Nothing hinges on me with God's promise to glorify me one day. There's nothing that I can do. I have responsibilities, yes. God wants me to be sanctified. God wants me to seek after Him and things like that. But my glorification, my salvation is not dependent upon anything that I do, and that ought to be a comfort to you as well. I've met many Christians who they kept falling into some kind of habitual sin or some kind of addiction, and it would depress them, and they would begin to wonder, well, am I saved? Does God really love me because all these things are happening? Well, we see here that Abram is going to fail in his trust of God's promise. He had the faith that was credited to him for righteousness. God made this amazing promise, but he's going to try to take matters in his own hands. But God still fulfills his end of the promise. And as a Christian, God has promised to glorify me one day because of my faith in the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, and that nothing I do, no amount of good works, is going to make me any more saved. And while I ought not to commit bad works, the bad works I do not take away from my salvation, because it is a work that is completely dependent upon God Himself, and it has nothing to do with me. So we'll take a look we'll take a further look at the life of Abram. We'll probably get all the way up to Sodom and Gomorrah as well. We'll see the finishing of the story of Lot. So I appreciate y'all's attention, and thanks for being here this morning.